This podcast is brought to you by Al Jazeera.
Hello and welcome. Is it more important to keep the peace than to see justice served? What about if those escaping justice are accused of human rights abuses, even murder and torture? It seems the people of Uruguay believe it is better not to dig up a dark past, and they voted to keep a controversial 20-year amnesty law. The statute in question, known as the Expiry Law, grants amnesty to military and police officials for crimes committed inside the country between 1973 and 1985. During this period, many military governments in Latin America coordinated efforts to silence their leftist movements, and thousands of Uruguayans were detained and tortured. As many as 231 Uruguayans are considered to be the disappeared. In 1985, a general amnesty was granted to the country's guerrilla movements, and soon afterwards, Uruguay's Congress passed an amnesty law for the military and police. That law was ratified by the public in 1989, but just last week, Uruguay's Supreme Court stepped in and ruled that the law was unconstitutional. It's a decision that many legal analysts believe may be widely applied to other cases and could allow prosecutors to pursue those who committed human rights abuses in the name of the military-civilian government. On today's show, with the Uruguayan public and the court system appearing on opposite sides of the debate, we ask, should amnesty ever be granted for human rights abusers? And what's next for Uruguay as it unravels its past? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Well, joining me now to discuss this from Montevideo is Felipe Michelini, the Vice President of the leftist New Space Party, which is part of the governing Broad Front coalition. He's also the son of the late Senator Zelmar Michelini, who was assassinated in 1976 as part of Operation Condor, a coordinated campaign in the 1970s and 80s targeting opposition groups in Latin America. From Bogota, I'm joined by Javier Sciorliza, the America's Director for the International Center for Transitional Justice. An attorney, Mr. Sciorliza served as Executive Secretary to the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of Peru and also guided truth commissions and judiciary processes in Paraguay, Kenya, Indonesia and Liberia. Gentlemen, I welcome you to the show, and perhaps Mr. Felipe Michelini, if I could start with you. In this case, do you think, looking at the referendum, that the Uruguayan people have basically voted for peace over justice?
Well, first of all, just to say hello to all people. I think that that dilemma shouldn't be necessary. I think Uruguayan people is looking for justice. The means and ways is very different in the country, and I think that since 1985 that our country recovered democracy, we are trying to make the state comply with its obligations to international covenants. And I think that last week's sentence from the Supreme Court is very good news for those that are looking for their for truth and justice.
Well, Mr. Sciorliza, if I can ask you for your opinion on the way things have gone, why do you think Uruguayans have voted to keep that law, that controversial amnesty law, instead of repealing it as the Supreme Court was looking to do?
First of all, we have to remember that human rights issues are those issues that could be, of course, part of democracy, but are not linked necessarily with a majority vote. So the decisions about how to apply this amnesty law or how to pursue justice is linked more with values and rights and not necessarily with a percentage of electors that can support or not the derogation or the annulment of a law. It's difficult from here to say why Uruguayans has opted by a slight majority, and we have to remember that almost 48% of the Uruguayans expressly said that they didn't agree with the law that granted amnesty in 1986 in Uruguay. But it is hard to say. Perhaps it is linked with the Uruguayan electoral process and the decision to have both elections at the same day. This perhaps caused certain harm to the possibilities to annul this law. But the most important thing is to remind that the pursuit of justice is not linked necessarily with a majority vote.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Perhaps, Mr. Michelini, I could ask you about that. Was it a mistake, do you think, to link this amnesty law referendum with the presidential election. Did that complicate the situation?
And we have to recall the specific case of the Uruguayan situation, that where was the impunity law was passed in 1986, and then the many relatives of the victims pushed forward a referendum against that law. So, and that was lost, and I will say that it was lost because from the executive power, there was a lot of pressure telling the majority population that the military regime could come back. So I will say that a lot of people vote for fear. And I will say also that from that referendum, 1989, up to now, loss of majority of NGOs and the popular movement has looking forward to make our Uruguayan state comply with justice. And I have to recall the Inter-American Commission resolution 2992 that established that Uruguay was not complying with Inter-American Covenant on Human Rights. That established clearly that the state has to prevent and have to investigate and punish those responsible for human rights abuses. And abuses that are basically torture and extrajudicial killings and disappearances. I wouldn't say that it's a mistake to try to amend the Constitution to nullify a law that is clearly against international covenants.
Well, it's interesting, and I know your family situation is an interesting one, Mr. Michelini. We'll get onto that in a moment, but let me ask Mr. Ciolitza, it's kind of an interesting and complicated situation in actual fact, isn't it? Especially in a country like Uruguay, because you have people who are part of the guerrilla movement who are now running for government or have been part of the government. You have people who are part of the military system who are also in the mix. Is the complication the fact that everyone could be in some way implicated when it comes to amnesty? Because there was amnesty for the guerrillas and there was also amnesty for the militia, the military and the government. Is it too complicated to even start to look at who should be granted amnesty?
It shouldn't be a complication. In many countries in Latin America, we have the recent example of El Salvador, in which the former guerrilla front has become a new government. Many former guerrilla members are active part of the democratic system, and that is not a problem. I think that has enriched our politics in Latin America, and that has brought more justice and more accountability to the way in which politics is done in a peaceful way. I think we have to differentiate very clearly two things. One thing is the crimes that could have been committed in the occasion of certain subversive organizations during the 70s, the 80s, or the 90s, and that clearly has to be investigated or could be granted pardons. The other thing, and this is particularly relevant in countries such as Paraguay, is the terrorism of a state that was practiced throughout the region, not only nationally but also regionally, through cover-up operation like the Condor operation, in which thousands of persons were kidnapped, disappeared, murdered, tortured. There is a clear line that we have to make between those crimes that were committed under these subversive organizations in the 70s and the systematic pattern of crimes that were sponsored by the state. And in this sense, to equate these responsibilities is a serious mistake, a serious misunderstanding of what has been the history of Latin America during the 70s.
Now, Mr. Michelini, your father, Senator Zelmar Michelini, was assassinated while living in Buenos Aires, but it was actually while it was done before the period of 1985, but he was out of the country, which means actually under the amnesty law, there's some degree of amnesty and impunity for those who are involved.
But I will say that my father was killed in 1976 within the Operation Condor. There was the coordination of the military regimes during the 70s. And I will say that since the very moment that that crime happened, all families, and basically my mother, claimed for justice and truth and some way of to know what happened, but not basically only for him, but for all victims that were involved in the state crimes against humanity that the regimes of the military junta of Argentina, Uruguay and Chile committed. And what we say is that we don't want to adjudicate the peace process or the transition process. What we want to submit before the courts of the Uruguayan courts are the cases of crimes against humanity. And I don't think that majority rule has a way to preclude this human right. And that's what the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its resolution specific of Uruguay, but has also about Argentina and Chile established, and also the Human Rights Committee of the Civil and Political Rights Covenant established.
But Mr. Michelini, it must be. Sir, I say it must be particularly difficult for you, though, personally, when you have one of the people who was implicated in the killing of your father running third in the election in Uruguay. That's Pedro Bordaberry.
Well, no.
Go ahead.
No, I understand the question, but that's another issue. He's the son of the dictator, and that man is in jail and was prosecuted by crimes against humanity. And well, the political struggle goes for a different path. What I say is that we want all those responsible that participated in these heinous crimes to be prosecuted before Uruguayan trials. And we'll keep fighting for this.
Okay, listen, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to stand by because we have to take a very short break now. We have more on this topic when we return, so don't go away. Welcome back. We're examining the reasons why Uruguayans have voted not to repeal a controversial amnesty law protecting the police and military from prosecution on charges of severe human rights abuses. Is it a case of choosing to keep the peace rather than pursuing the cause of justice? Well, with me to discuss the issue from Montevideo is Felipe Michelini, Vice President of the leftist New Space Party and son of the late Senator Zelmar Michelini, who was assassinated in 1976. From Bogota, we have Javier Ciurliza, the America's Director for the International Center of Transitional Justice. He also served as Executive Secretary to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Peru. As we get back to questions, Mr. Ciurliza, let me ask you this question that came in from a viewer. Now, of course, Uruguay has ordered the extradition of Henry Kissinger, but the issue of whether or not the USA will ever answer for its involvement has come up from many viewers. And this email from David in West Virginia in the USA says, do you think Kissinger will ever be questioned in a court of law about his participation in Operation Condor?
I can't say about the specific case of Mr. Kissinger, but what I can say is that it is quite evident by now, according to the declassified information that the State Department by itself in US has released in the last 15 years, that the participation of the US government in the coups given in the southern cone countries of Latin America, like Chile and Brazil and others, had the active involvement and support of the US administrations, at least until at the end of the 70s, when Jimmy Carter started another kind of policies towards human rights. So I think that yes, US should acknowledge a responsibility not only in the support of dictatorships in the middle of a Cold War in which even the thugs and the dictators were preferred instead of democracies in many countries, including Latin America, but also because it concurred in the formation and training of military officers in the School of Americas and other training processes in US that were formed into the so-called national security doctrine that part the world into the bad and the good, in which the bad, the communist, and every single person that were suspected to be allied with the communists had to be eliminated. So this was, of course, a political message, very damaging towards the democracy and human rights.
Right.
So I think that beside the personality of Henry Kissinger, US, of course, has a responsibility pending to be acknowledged in this issue.
Now, Mr. Michelini, on that topic, we had this email from a viewer in Michigan in the USA. Linda Taylor wrote in asking or saying, crimes against humanity always need to be punished. As far as Uruguay goes, this will keep happening unless the US shuts down the School of the Americas. They have an agenda and have produced many dictators and military coups. Now, I wonder, in your opinion, how important is it for the US to answer for its actions that have led to much of the shaping of politics in Latin America, certainly towards the end of the last century?
Oh, that's clear. The training on the School of the Americas was a key issue on those responsible later for the coup d'etat and state terrorism. So I think that the US has a lot to say on this, and I think it's important to, in some way, to reconsider the role of the US during those times. I'm sure that crimes against humanity should be punished, and those who ordered, cooperated, or in some way were involved in those crimes should be prosecuted before the courts.
The question that just came in from our live station, Mr. Sirlica, this came in from Petros in Cyprus via live station, our chat room online. It says, if criminals are granted amnesty, then what would stop others from repeating the same crime? It's a simple question, but I guess it comes down to setting a standard and setting a tone that perhaps sends a message as well.
In 1983, the first Truth Commission in history, the National Commission on the Disappeared in Argentina, titled its final report with the word "never again." And this phrase, "never again," includes a powerful message of the need to guarantee the non-repetition of the crude events that took place in our countries, and particularly in Uruguay and in other southern cone countries during the 70s. The despise of the human being, the irrelevance of human rights, the violation of the basic conditions of human dignity in the disappearances in the southern cone was widespread, was impugned, and impunity sent a powerful message to violators that any crime can be committed on the name and on behalf of superior values. So the message from our friend in Cyprus is very relevant, in a way in which the impunity is not a matter of the past, it's a matter of the present. If we send to the future generations the message that crimes can be committed because no justice will be met, we are preparing the destroy of our democracies and the destroy of the hopes of our children. So the fight for prosecutions, the fight for justice, is not a fight for the past, it's a fight for the future.
But of course, Mr. Sirlica, what you have is issues that are being discussed and looked at from about a quarter of a century ago. So I wonder, when you look at the rest of the region, and the history they also share, the complicated history they also share, what Uruguay's referendum has, what implications it has for other countries in the region in terms of questioning how they move forward with issues of amnesty or not.
Latin America has moved forward a lot in terms of make crimes accountable and fight against impunity. As mentioned by Mr. Michelini, the Inter-American system on human rights has been very clear regarding the non-applicability of amnesties and any kind of pardons regarding crimes against humanity, war crimes, acts of genocide. In this sense, Latin America is pioneering in the world in terms of accountability. The decision taken in a vote in Uruguay can send, of course, troubling messages to other countries. However, I think, and I think we can agree with Mr. Michelini in this, that judges and the Supreme Court in Uruguay have the last word in this. And the Supreme Court in Uruguay last week has said clearly, in a specific case, that majority votes cannot determine the rights of the victims and the possibilities to pursue justice. So I think that even if this is a troubling message, and in countries like Brazil, in which there is also a struggle against impunity, we can be confident that judges and tribunals in the rule of law can affirm justice and order prosecutions in a proper way.
Well, let me ask Mr. Michelini then, what happens here? As listening to what Mr. Sirulita has just said about the Supreme Court's decision, what the people have said in Uruguay, is the Supreme Court's will independent of the people? Is the Supreme Court able to act independently? What happens next in Uruguay?
I think that all relatives that think that they have a case, they will submit it to the courts, and the courts will proceed. And if the government says that they want to apply the impunity law, they could just go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will apply the same decision, saying that this law is void, is not, cannot be applied, and is against the Uruguayan Constitution and is against the international treaties and covenants signed by Uruguay. So in that sense, the referendum was a good opportunity to push forward another step against impunity. But the sentence that the Supreme Court established last Monday shows that justice in Uruguay could be done. And I think it's very important to recall what happened in 1989 after the referendum, that the president of that moment said that this issue was closed. Well, Uruguayans still are very committed to justice, truth, and working for putting the perpetrators in jail.
Well, gentlemen, listen, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We have run out of time, but thank you very much for taking part in this debate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And remember, you can follow the show via Facebook. Go there now and you'll get an update on the topics we're looking at this week. You can also give us your questions and comments there for us to include in the show. That's it from me and the team. We'll see you next time.